You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things technical related to vertebrate pest management. So glad to have you on board. Hope your week went well. If you want to reach out to me, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. In fact, one of our topics here today is from a listener who wanted me to address it. So I do read the emails when they come in. You can see my website here. Some of the materials that we have, books, also consultation. Perhaps you'd like to have me do a training for your particular business, or maybe polish up a PowerPoint that you're going to be giving at a conference. We'd love to hear from you and get you set up in that particular regard. Also work with organizing photos. So if you're looking to organize photos, you should be taking photos, but a lot of times people don't have them organized very well. I can help you with that as well. All right. Well, what are we going to talk about this week? Well, we're going to talk about carbon monoxide fumigation. So let me get my PowerPoint up. There it is. So carbon monoxide fumigation, and so we're going to be dealing with this particular element. Why? Because one of our listeners thought I should get into carbon monoxide injectors. So this is a foundational piece that's required for understanding carbon monoxide injectors. So let's get started. First thing we need to do, of course, is understand what is fumigation to begin with. Fumigation is a type of pesticide application because it uses a different formulation. Many of us are familiar with baits, for example, like rodenticides or perhaps sprays, or uses a liquid form. Well, with fumigation, you're using a gaseous form, so it poisons the organism by utilizing the animal's breathing. And so since we're dealing with vertebrates here, typically that's going to be an enclosed space because you got to keep the gas contained in order to kill the animals. So it's typically burrow fumigation. So where a bait is something eaten and then ingested and provides the poison, this is inhaled and provides the poison in that regard. Now, there are advantages with fumigants. Of course, there's no secondary poisoning risk. So when you treat an area, you don't have to worry about those carcasses being a potential poison risk to a scavenger, for example. This is one of the reasons why fumigation, particularly carbon monoxide fumigation, is beginning to take off, because of this particular advantage. And also, carbon monoxide injectors are not regulated, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. So there's no residuals. You don't have to worry about that. How in the exclusion times are generally shorter because there's no residual, right? So when you treat a field, you're not worried about bait being left on the surface of the ground that's available for some other animal to eat it. Now, aluminum phosphide gives a little bit of a change there, but for general purposes, you don't have that kind of residual. We're going to put aluminum phosphide off to the side, but certainly it doesn't have anywhere near the residual that, let's say, putting bait out, which can last for several days on the surface of the ground before it's consumed. It's also more weather tolerant, so you don't want your bait getting rained on. In some cases, having your bait rained on will actually reduce its efficacy, but with fumigation, you don't have to worry about that, right? So in fact, moist soil actually makes fumigation more effective than dry soil. So in that case, you don't have to watch the weather quite as hard as you would if you're doing a field baiting. Now, there are disadvantages with fumigants. The first one, of course, is cost. It is 5 to 10 times more expensive in materials and labor to perform the same treatment that you would do with baits, for example. So those advantages always come with a downside, and the downside is cost. Now, for small areas like someone's yard, or maybe maybe an acre or so, those costs are not really that prohibitive. You start getting out to 40 acres, 80 acres, 160 acres, it really gets very consuming in terms of the cost. And so that's where the challenge, you'd have to really be dedicated to a fumigation method. You also have some exclusions around structures, right? So you may say, well, I see this burrow going underneath a building. Can I fumigate that? The answer, pretty much no, because you don't want to be poisoning the people inside the building. There's also a fire risk with some fumigants, right? Ignitable gas cartridges can burn pretty vigorously. There was a case out of Canada where a guy was trying to fumigate a woodchuck, and the woodchuck burrowed underneath the building. He fumigated, the woodchuck ran out of the hole, and he burned the building down. So that was that's certainly not a good day. Also, you have the challenge of non-target kills. And say, what do you mean by that? So, well, sometimes two different species will occupy the same burrow. So if you fumigate that burrow, both species would die. Where if you used a bait, chances are only one of those species would be attracted to the bait. Let me give an illustration. It's like if you have a ground squirrel and a snake occupying the same burrow, the snake isn't interested in your bait, but the ground squirrel would be. But if you fumigated that burrow, everything in the burrow dies. That means the snake and the ground squirrel. So that's one of the downsides of fumigation. So what are the different kinds of fumigants that we have? And I'm going to be categorizing these basically by their regulation. So you have non-regulated. By that I mean they're not regulated by the EPA. Then you have the regulated versions, and that's the general use products, and then the restricted use products. Underneath the non-regulated field, you have carbon monoxide injectors. And so that one is the one we're going to be basically focusing on here. However, understand that giant destroyers and the Pocatello Supply Depot ignitable gas cartridges, those use carbon monoxide as their active ingredient as well when they burned. I mean, it's not going to be listed as the active ingredient, but when they burn, that becomes the active ingredient. So those two products are also use carbon monoxide, but they're regulated. Why? Because they're treated as a pesticide. You may say, well, Stephen, why are the carbon monoxide injectors not considered a pesticide? Well, because the EPA calls them a device. Now, my understanding is that some states, thinking of Colorado here, require you to have a pesticide license to use carbon monoxide injectors. I could be wrong on that, so you can have some state regulation on carbon monoxide injectors. But as far as the EPA is concerned, you're all set. So make sure you check your state regulations on the use of carbon monoxide injectors. Then you have, of course, dry ice and bottled. That's dry ice, of course, gases off as carbon dioxide. That's CO2, not CO, CO2. And then, of course, you have Leafetex bottled carbon dioxide treatment. Both of those products are general use as well. Now, just because they're general use doesn't mean you can use them without a license. What general use means is you can use them without a license on your own property. Once you start using these products on someone else's property, I'm not aware of any state in the union that doesn't require you to have a pesticide license, what they would call a commercial pesticide license to use it. So again, check your state regulations. That's with your Department of Agriculture would be a great place to start there. And then lastly, you have the phosphine gas, and this is the fumitoxin. These are the pellets that people put in their grain bins. It's also used for structural fumigation, but it does also have a vertebrate pest fumigation portion that they use them on prairie dogs and ground squirrels and the like of that. Recent regulations that came in 2026, the EPA now requires specialized training for using fumigants. It's called non-soil fumigation category, and most states have had to add that category. There are a few that already had such rigorous fumigation training that they didn't have to add anything. They were already meeting the EPA standard. But for the vast majority of us, there was another category. The state I'm in had to add another non-soil fumigation category. So if you want to use aluminum phosphide products, you're going to have a separate category to treat that in most circumstances. So again, check your regulations. All right. So I think I've beat that drum pretty hard, but we're going to focus on carbon monoxide. So what is it? There's the CAS number. If you want to do a deep dive on carbon monoxide, that's definitely the way that what you're searching for. This kind of sort of a universal code for carbon monoxide. But it's a colorless, odorless gas. And so what this means is you're not going to know that it exists. If you smell anything funky, it's often from the fuel that hasn't burned completely, but you're not smelling carbon monoxide, you're smelling the petroleum type products that you're going to be getting there. But a lot of people die each year, by a lot. I mean, I think there's probably 20 or so. I haven't looked it up, but it's enough to be significant where people are getting poisoned by carbon monoxide in their homes, typically during the wintertime. Very tragic. And they die from this. And so it's serious. And so the immediately dangerous to life or health level is 1,200 parts per million. I want you to keep that number in mind, right? So this is telling you that once you start hitting that level, things are bad, right? It doesn't mean that below that level it's safe. It just means things are starting to get bad at that particular level. And of course, exposure time also matters. So how does carbon monoxide, again, monoxide, CO, not CO2, CO. I want to be sure we're clear on that. This is what makes it poisonous. Well, what happens is your hemoglobin is designed to capture oxygen, bring that oxygen through your blood to different parts of your body, and then take carbon dioxide waste and then dispose of it out as you exhale. So you inhale the oxygen, gets into your bloodstream through the hemoglobin, then your hemoglobin deposits the oxygen, takes on the CO2, comes up to the lungs, and then releases the CO2. Carbon monoxide screws that all up, because carbon monoxide is very attractive to hemoglobin. So if your hemoglobin has a choice between grabbing an oxygen molecule or a carbon monoxide molecule, it'll always grab a carbon monoxide molecule. And it likes carbon monoxide so much, it doesn't want to let it go. So what you have is hemoglobin now moving through your body. When it should be carrying oxygen, it's not carrying oxygen, it's carrying carbon monoxide. So it's not available to carry that oxygen to your body. So you basically die, you suffocate at the cellular level. So you're still moving air in and out of your lungs, but it's not getting to the cells. Why? Because carbon monoxide has taken the seat that should be occupied by your oxygen. So if you have maybe a bunch of wheelbarrows in your bloodstream, and each wheelbarrow carries oxygen. Every time a carbon monoxide molecule is there, that replaces the oxygen, so the oxygen can't sit there in the wheelbarrow. Now you have carbon monoxide. And if enough of those wheelbarrows are filled, you die, because you're basically suffocating from a lack of oxygen. That's what makes it so serious. Okay, this is what makes it dangerous. Now, when you're getting at the 6,400 parts per million level, again, remember that 1,200 we talked about earlier, in 2 minutes, you're going to start feeling headache and dizziness. Now, your symptoms may be different. Don't try this at home, obviously, but it's just telling you it doesn't take just 3 times more. You're going to really be in a world of hurt within 2 minutes of exposure. So it doesn't take much. There's a reason why firefighters are going into buildings with respirators on, right? Their own air, because it's a toxic environment when they're going into a burning building. At 200 parts per million, that's really low. That's 1/6 the level of the IDLH that we mentioned earlier. At 200 parts per million exposure, you're going to start getting headaches in 2 to 3 hours. So keep in mind, headaches are an early sign of carbon monoxide poisoning. It's not the only sign, and you may not get the headaches. My point is if you're working with carbon monoxide and you start getting a headache, do not ignore that. You shouldn't be getting a headache, but if you are, that means something may be going wrong. You need to find out if you're being exposed to carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, here's the other kicker. Even if you recover, let's say you accidentally poisoned yourself with carbon monoxide and you recover, you may think everything's fine. Not necessarily. Sometimes the negative effects of carbon monoxide poisoning aren't known for weeks. And one of those effects is damage to your neurological system. Take this pesticide seriously. Okay, this is a dangerous chemical. Not the most dangerous chemical, but it is dangerous. Do not toy with it. If you're careful, things should be okay. I've used carbon monoxide injectors. I think I'm okay, right? But nevertheless, it's not a toy. Just like the analogy I use with people, guns are dangerous if you don't point them the right way. If you point them the right way, things should be okay. But if you don't point them the right way, bad things will happen. Same thing with carbon monoxide, right? We're exposed to carbon monoxide all the time. If you drive a gasoline-powered vehicle, you're being exposed to carbon monoxide. But you don't want to be exposed to it unnecessarily and in an excess. Adult exposure to carbon monoxide is of a different order than unborn children or children exposure. Children have much higher respiratory rates. They don't have the same capacity to handle attacks to our well-being as adults can. So they're much more vulnerable. This is why you need to be very, very careful of the use of carbon monoxide around children and around buildings. That's why it's a bad idea, even if the label allows you to do it. Because if some of that gas gets into the building, you can harm people, and children and unborn children are significantly more at risk to carbon monoxide poisoning than a full-on healthy adult. So take a look at relative risk here. This is a website from the University of Texas at Dallas, and it has classifications on hazardous gases. And I'm just trying to give you an idea of relative risk here. And so you notice the 4, the bigger the number here under hazard class. Let me kind of blow that up a little bit more for you. The bigger the risk under hazard class, the bigger the number, the higher the risk. So let's take a look down here to carbon monoxide. All right, carbon monoxide has a number 2. Okay, but notice carbon dioxide has a number 1. So it's less hazardous than carbon monoxide. And then if we go down to phosphine gas, hopefully you're not getting dizzy as I'm scrolling through here. Okay, phosphine gas has a hazard level of 4. That is significantly more hazardous than carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is more hazardous than carbon dioxide. So if you have a choice, if you're looking for safety purposes, carbon dioxide is a better choice for treating vertebrate pests than carbon monoxide, because carbon monoxide has a higher risk. And then, of course, phosphine gas has a significantly higher risk than that. Just something you may want to check out. Just look up risk-safety.utdallas.edu, and that will be some information for you there. All right, let me get my slide back up again. All right, now we're down to safer use of carbon monoxide devices. So you want to avoid getting exposed. You want to stay upwind. If you're treating a field or treating burrows, you want to be sure you're staying upwind. Monitor your health, right? One of the things when you're a wildlife control operator is you're powering through. We ignore the scrapes and bruises and pains, and sometimes later when we're done with work, we're like, where did I get that scratch from? Why do I ache here? Don't ignore headaches, dizziness, nausea, blurred vision when you're in the field, okay? So if this happens, these are early signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. You should not have this if you were following good practices with using carbon monoxide-based products, whether it's the pesticide, the ignitable gas cartridge, or the carbon monoxide injectors. So just make sure you don't ignore it. Don't power through. Make sure you take a break and get an evaluation. Is this just a headache because it's hot, or is this a headache because I've been exposing myself to carbon monoxide? Keep a safe distance away from structures. Now, this information comes from Colorado regulations, and I think, I could be wrong, but I think these are reasonable standards to use. I think this is responsible regulation, and I commend the Colorado Department of Agriculture for employing these. These are guidelines in Colorado that govern how close you can get to a structure when you're treating certain animals, the burrows of certain animals. Ground squirrel, 20 feet. Rat, 20 feet. Prairie dog, 100 feet. Pocket gophers, 150 feet. Everything else, 150 feet. So if you're using a carbon monoxide injector, a carbon monoxide device, the rule of thumb should be follow the guidelines of the manufacturer, or follow these guidelines is what I'm suggesting, whichever one is greater. In other words, the one that has more restriction is the one you want to follow. So if the manufacturer guidelines are stricter than the state of Colorado, then use your manufacturer guidelines. If the Colorado guidelines are stricter than your manufacturer, I'm going to suggest you follow the Colorado guidelines. I just think these are reasonable. They're not too excessive. We can tweak around, do you really need to give 100 feet for a prairie dog burrow? We could debate that. But nevertheless, I think it's probably a good idea to follow these guidelines so that way you are making sure no carbon monoxide from your treatments getting into that structure. All right. And so you're never wrong protecting public health. Okay? If you're always thinking about how do I make sure I don't harm my client or harm their children or harm their pets, you're not going to be going wrong. All right. So you want to be sure you're thinking about that type of risk. And I think this is reasonable. You may want to, decide for yourself whether you want to follow that or not. This is my recommendation to you because I think it's a reasonable guideline in this regard. Well, that is our part 1 of fumigation with carbon monoxide, giving you a little bit of background on the active ingredient there. We'll talk more about ignitable gas, the carbon monoxide injectors, well, a lot of terms here, and in the next podcast when we get down to talking about some of those and some of the uses of them in the field. All right. I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to the Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Hope you found this helpful, useful for you in terms of your training and understanding both the benefits and the risks of carbon monoxide as a treatment for burrowing rodents. We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, yes, even criticisms, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And remember, this is the Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. We'd love to have you subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you can be made aware of all other future editions of the podcast. And we're all about providing technical information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Why? Because if you're doing the same thing that everybody else is doing, how do you have a competitive advantage? So we're going to give you information that's not readily available to everyone else. We hope you consider that and listen to us on our weekly podcast. All right, well, that's it. Take care, everyone.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.